Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism webinar focused on electricity. This event is organized by the Directorate General for Taxation and Customs Union, DG Taxud of the European Commission. My name is Alina, and I have been part of the CBAM team since the proposal, and for today I will be the moderator. Firstly, I would like to raise some rules. There are many participants in this meeting, so let's make sure you appear on Zoom with your name and your affiliation. Then that, if needed, you can rename yourself by following the steps that are shown right now on the screen that you can see on the presentation. And this is very useful and necessary for us when addressing your questions, so please make sure that you do that. So now, these are some of the housekeeping rules we have prepared. Please make sure you're muted throughout the webinar. Take note that the webinar is being recorded and will be made public. Video recording is not allowed for the webinar. That will be done by us. Please write your questions in the chat and they will be answered at the end of the webinar. A feedback survey will appear on your screen at the end of the webinar, and do feel free to respond. And the presentation will be uploaded on the DG Taxud CBAM website, where you can find the link here, and you can also find additional materials on the CBAM and some interesting information that might be useful for you. So now that we have set the housekeeping rules, we would like to raise a question based on which entity defines you best. So please do feel free to answer it within the next 20 seconds. Okay, thank you very much. So we can see that we have a very large audience, both from the EU and outside of the EU. So great to have you all here. And now let me navigate you through the objectives of this session. So firstly, this is the agenda for today. We will start with the CBAM general overview. Then we will go on to the termination of embedded emissions in the electricity sector. Then we will have an overview of CBAM actors and reporting declarants. And finally, we will focus on the submission of CBAM reports. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome Marilena Scopio, Director Marilena Scopio of DG Taxud. That is the Director for Indirect Taxation and Tax Administration, to say a few words. So, Elena, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I am very happy to be here today and to say a few introductory words on this webinar. My colleagues have been trying to do whatever they can to inform all stakeholders, and you will excuse them if there are a bit of technical hiccups. The audience is very, very wide, and therefore it can happen that there are some technical problems, but we count on your understanding. Today, we are trying to explain to you what is going to happen in a few days, in fact, because it's very close to entering into force in its transitional period. But just a word of background and framework. CBAM, as you know, is a cornerstone of our climate measures. It was announced in 2019 as part of the Green Deal and the Fit for 55. It was adopted, it was proposed by the European Commission in 2021, and with the clear view to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% in 2030 and to reach climate neutrality in 2050. Now that we have adopted it, we have to try to put it in place in order to take all the necessary measures that we need to take to face this unprecedented climate crisis that we have been witnessing this summer in particular all around the world. So the question is not if we have to do it, but if, when, and how. And CBAM plays a role into this architecture of trying to address this climate change that was announced but not really addressed in substantial way before, at least for what concerns its external side. As you know, CBAM tries to put a fair price on the carbon which is emitted during the production of carbon-intensive goods that are coming from other member states and that are entering coming from other states and that are entering the EU. This tries to put our producers that are subject to the ETS on the same level playing field as those that are established in other countries. I have to say that the effect of only announcing CBAM have already been visible. We have been in touch with several parties in other countries that are willing to consider introducing systems that are similar to CBAM or systems that can put a price on carbon. This is already a big result because we need to do it all together. We need to do it as a whole. We understand that this is going to be a burden on a number of stakeholders. That's why we are here to explain what this transitional phase that will start on the 1st of October will bring about. It will only be theoretical, if you want, and as you probably already know. My colleagues will go into the details and will be able to explain to you what are the different steps and the different obligations that are put in place. It will be only at the end of the transitional period that conclusions will be drawn, modifications where needed will be done, and then there will be the entry into force of what is the definitive CBAM phase with purchase, resale of certificates and adjustment at the border. We are now in a phase of dialogue with countries, dialogue with those countries that are in special need, for instance, the least developed countries. Let me just remind you that the EU is one of the biggest contributors to the climate financing worldwide, but also with you, with the stakeholders, with the public authorities, business, federations, media, NGOs, you name. And this dialogue is concretized in a number of different initiatives, one of which is the webinar of today. This webinar will be recorded and it will be at the disposal of yourself or the ones who were not able to participate in the dedicated webpage on CBAM. We will also be preparing written guidance, online trainings, e-learning courses. The webpage is a meeting point where you can get updated on all the different elements that will be put at your attention, and it will be updated regularly and translated in the main spoken languages in the world. I am very happy to see that you are so many today, and I believe that we can do it together. We are all the intentions to try to help as much as we can. We are a small team, but of extraordinary people that will do their utmost to guide everyone through this change that shouldn't be seen as a burden, but should be seen with a glimpse of hope, because we are trying really to change something beyond our immediate sphere of activity, action, and competence. So I would like to leave you in the very good hands of my colleagues, and I wish you all an excellent webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you very much. This was a great reminder of the rationale behind CBAM, and I am very happy now to give the floor to my colleague Roma, who will present to us the general rules on CBAM by starting by the main target of the CBAM initiative.
Thank you very much, Elena. So before discussing the CBAM in details, we really have to look at another instrument, the EU ETS. It's the emissions trading system. So since 2005, we have this carbon market in the EU. It covers around 40% of the EU's economy. And we've used this to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with our climate targets. And the CBAM now comes into play. It exists to complement, to reinforce the ETS. So as the EU has been stepping up its climate action very recently, we are gradually phasing out free allocation as part of this ETS given to EU producers. And the CBAM here comes to mitigate the risk of carbon leakage. Now, carbon leakage, it happens when companies transfer production to places where decarbonization requirements, they are less strict than in the EU. So basically, when you replace EU products with more carbon-intensive imports, and that would lead to increasing emissions globally, and that would undermine our climate mitigation efforts, and we don't want that. So that's where the CBAM intervenes. We subject the import of certain goods to the same carbon price these products would have paid if they had been produced in the EU. So that's how it complements the ETS. The CBAM puts a carbon price on imports of certain goods that are produced in non-EU countries, imported into the EU, and that carbon price will be calculated in a way that it is equivalent to the one that would have been paid if the producers of the good were located in the EU. So another important objective of the CBAM is to encourage non-EU countries and their producers to decarbonize the production processes. So any clean innovation, any efforts made by the producer to decarbonize a CBAM product will translate into a reduction of the CBAM obligations for that given product. So here, for electricity. The CBAM was adopted at EU level and officially entered into force in May this year. And during the summer, the EU has also adopted the implementing regulation that lays out the reporting rules for the transitional period that will start applying from the start of next week, as of the 1st October 2023. So the transitional phase, it's a 2 years period during which the CBAM will focus on monitoring and on reporting. So monitoring first, because, well, it's a learning period for us, during which we collect all the relevant information on the embedded carbon content of the goods covered by the regulation and imported into the EU. So that information we collect, it will help us refine the rules and make sure that those applicable during the definitive phase actually come to learn from what we've had, from the data we've collected before. So basically, it's about rolling out the system for the next 2 years, preparing everybody, including ourselves, including the member states, for the smooth kick-in of the CBAM ahead of the definitive period on the 1st of January 2026. And then reporting as well, because, well, during the entire transitional period, you will have reporting declarants that will only need to do one thing, that is complying with reporting obligation. So there will be no financial adjustments, no CBAM certificates to surrender during that transitional period. However, quarterly CBAM reports, they will need to be submitted, and they will need to describe the embedded emissions of the CBAM goods, so here of electricity, imported into the EU from the 1st of October. So as you can see on the screen, so the required information, that includes the total quantity of each goods expressed in megawatt hours for electricity, specified per installation producing the good in the country of origin. There's then the total embedded emissions of each type of good, so here electricity, expressed in ton of CO2 emissions per megawatt hours of electricity. And finally, the carbon price due in a country of origin for the embedded emissions for the imported goods, taking into account any relevant rebates or other forms of compensation. So the carbon price, for example, that has been paid. So you may be wondering, why do you have to report that carbon price paid in the country of origin? Because there's no financial obligation, as I just said, during the transitional period. That is for the purpose of collecting data already during the transitional period to make sure that we know what carbon pricing there is and which one we can deduct from 2026 onwards. And similarly, but it doesn't really matter for electricity, we also require to declare both direct and indirect emissions as part of the transitional period. But there's, for electricity, as I said, there's no indirect emissions, so you can only focus on direct emissions. And as a point, sanctions, the member states' national competent authorities, they may impose sanctions in case of failure to comply with the reporting obligations. In case the reporting declarant does not submit the CBAM report in time, for example, or when there's a clear bad faith in the dialogue between the reporting declarant and the national competent authority, for example. Finally, but you might have understood that by now, we're not presenting the definitive phase of the CBAM. You should still be aware that from 2026, the reported embedded emissions, they will need to be verified by an EU accredited verifier, following the same principle that under the ETS. But again, this does not apply for the transitional period. There will also be a gradual phasing in of the CBAM financial adjustments between 2026 and 2034. That is to ensure that free allowances under the ETS is also taken into account in the financial obligation for the CBAM. But there again, it does not apply for the transitional period. And for the rest of the webinar, we are going to focus only on the transitional period. So the aim of this slide is to answer one question. It's which emissions fall into the scope of the CBAM during the transitional phase. So as a start, there are three categories of emissions. We number them from 1 to 3. They mirror the ETS. So the CBAM focuses on direct emissions. These are the emissions generated from the production of goods at the installation level. Direct emissions, so it's emissions from heating and cooling, even if the process takes place outside installation. And in the case of electricity, actually, it's fairly simple. We can stop here. You don't need to look all the other arrows on the slide because there's no indirect emissions under electricity. You only need to worry about the direct emissions. Just for your general understanding, for the other CBAM goods, you should be aware that we also include in the scope of the CBAM scope 2 emissions, the consumption of electricity we use to produce the CBAM good, as well as some scope 3 emissions, which are upstream emissions from CBAM goods that are used as inputs into the CBAM goods called complex goods. Those are called precursors. Downstream emissions, so consumption, transportation, distribution, those are that are in blue in the slide you see, they are outside the scope of the CBAM for any CBAM goods. They do not need to be reported on.
Thank you very much, Romain. Now let's give the floor to our colleagues, Claudia and Ignacio. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alina. So now we're going to present the particularities and the specifics of electricity as a CBAM good. It has, as I mentioned, particular characteristics which are reflected in the methodology for determining their embedded emissions. As you see on the screen, we only have one CN code for electricity and the greenhouse gas emissions that are concerned for the CBAM are carbon dioxide. Some key terms of the CBAM, such as complex goods, production process, production route, or aggregated goods, have been already presented in previous webinars, and we will also describe with further detail in the next webinars that we foresee to have next week, but these terms are not relevant for the CBAM of electricity. There is one CN code, as I just mentioned, and what is important is that in the electricity sector, only carbon dioxide is concerned, since it's the primary greenhouse emitted during the production of electricity. My colleague Ignacio, here with me from the Directorate General for Energy, will further elaborate on how to determine the emission factor for calculating these embedded emissions. Over to you, Ignacio.
Thank you, Claudia. Welcome and good morning. Well, what I'm going to explain now is hopefully in a simplified way, the methodology to calculate direct emissions coming from electricity. Just to give a broad overview and before going to details, as my colleague said, in electricity as a good, that is the electricity that is imported via the different interconnectors with third countries, only direct emissions apply, that is scope 1. And the way to calculate the emissions related to electricity produced are with a very basic equation, which is formula the multiplication of the electricity produced coming from fossil fuel sources and the emission factor for this electricity. I will elaborate further on this emission factor, which is key to understand how the emissions will be calculated on the next slide. But first, I would like to go through the different hierarchy of the emission factors, which is important to understand the particularities of CBAM for electricity. So the first approach to calculate the emissions for electricity is through the use of a CO2 emission factor based on data from the International Energy Agency that the Commission will provide via the CBAM Transitional Registry. I will show in the next slide how the overall methodology for calculating these values was done. However, it's important to understand that this is the default approach, and all the different CBAM declarants can start with this. However, if there is no specific value that was calculated for a specific third country, then the second approach is to use the CO2 emission factor of the European Union, which is also based on this same dataset from the International Energy Agency. However, it is relevant to know that the Commission has all, if not, I mean, almost all countries that are currently have interconnection with the European Union member state. And we also consider some future projects to enhance interconnections with the European Union. So those are also included. However, if a reporting declarant submits sufficient evidence based on official and public information, and they can demonstrate that based on this reliable official and public information from statistic office, government, etc., is the CO2 factor that they calculate is lower than the one the Commission provides, then the reporting declarant might determine this CO2 emission factor based on this method, which is also defined in the implementing regulation. And fourth, which is also going to be explained in the following slide, is what we have called the conditionality, which is the conditions set out in the CBAM regulation in Annex 4.5 in the case that actual emissions may want to be claimed by a declarant, and that needs to comply with a certain list of conditions that we will go into detail further. So first, I will show the methodology of the calculation, first for the yearly emissions, and then how to calculate the final emission factor that is going to be used in this transitional period. So on the left side of the formula, we have the yearly CO2 emission factor for all fossil fuel technologies in the given year in the third country capable of exporting electricity to the European Union member states. So how is this going to be calculated? This is basically a weighted average between the total gross generation, electricity generation coming from all fossil fuel technologies from that third country in that specific year, which is obviously calculated by the multiplication of that electricity and the emission factor that is assigned to that type of technology in that country for that year by the dataset we have access from the International Energy Agency. And that, of course, is going to be divided to get the weighted average by the yearly gross electricity generation for each of the fossil fuel technologies. This is relevant also because this is not only the way the Commission calculates the CO2 emission factors for the transitional period, but also this is the methodology that is in the implementing act for the case that I explained recently, case C, in case any CBAM declarant would like to claim their own CO2 emission factor based on the information I provided before. And the final factor will be a moving average of the previous 5 years, starting from the current year minus 2 years. This is to certain reasons that we use this methodology. First, to use a number of years that will reflect the trade-offs between decarbonization policies, which for us is very important and is one of the main ideas behind this regulation is to promote and incentivize decarbonization policies in third countries. So the advancement of these policies that will, of course, materialize with higher capacity of renewables and therefore higher generation from these renewable sources. And of course, the different type of climatic years that could impact on the generation mix of each of the years. For example, there could be a year that was dry with less rain, therefore affecting hydropower, or with less wind affecting wind generation. And as the formula explained, the the final emission factor will be the average of the last 5 years, as I mentioned, starting from 2 years before the current year. Why is that? It's because to have as much statistical information possible, which it is feasible within that amount of years. That amount of years, meaning now and counting 2 years before, normally the information is already available. Well, now I'll give the floor to my colleague Claudia, which will explain into details the criteria for reporting actual emissions.
Thank you, Ignacio. So in the case of the CBAM for electricity, as happens with other CBAM goods, the declarant can report on actual embedded emissions through the emission factor of the electricity produced, but the following conditions have to be met. First, the amount of electricity for which the use of actual embedded emissions is claimed has to be covered by a power purchase agreement between the authorized CBAM declarant and a producer of electricity located in the third country. Second, the installation producing the electricity has to be either connected directly to the union transmission system, or it can be demonstrated that at the time of export, there was no physical network congestion at any point in the network between the installation and the union transmission system. Third, the installation producing electricity does not emit more than 550 grams of CO2 of fossil fuel origin per kilowatt hour of electricity. And lastly, the amount of electricity for which the use of actual embedded emissions is claimed has been firmly nominated to the allocated interconnection capacity by all responsible transmission system operators in the country of origin, the country of destination, and, if relevant, each country of transit. And the nominated capacity and the production of electricity by the installation refer to the same period of time, which shall be no longer than 1 hour. Please note and keep in mind that the criteria are cumulative, therefore, all requirements have to be fulfilled. And before coming back to the general reporting obligations for the CBAM, more concretely for the CBAM of electricity, some clarifications that have been raised recently on the electricity as a CBAM good. First one is who should be the CBAM declarant for the imports of electricity. So the CBAM declarant should be the person who is who appears like importer in the customs declaration. And according to the CBAM regulation, the Article 5.4, the declarant shall be the entity that to whom the transmission, the allocation of transmission capacity has been allocated, or the entity which allocates this transmission capacity. Another question that has been raised is where those default values come from. My colleague Ignacio already mentioned these are for the transitional period. Those are based on the International Energy Agency data. These represent 5 years average. And during the transitional period, we will develop an assessment to review the methodology and make any changes if those are necessary to better reflect climatic years, but also the efforts on the decarbonization of third countries. And any changes shall come once the definitive period starts in January 2026. And over
yes,
to you.
And finally, we would like to also clarify regarding questions in the case of what happened with electricity trade via anonymous exchange-based platforms. And for that, first I would like to refer to the CBAM regulation, where it says this, as long as there is no technical solution for the application of CBAM to importation of electricity into the customs territory of the Union, CBAM will not apply under market coupling or also called implicit allocation. So this CBAM will apply only to explicit trader at the border between a third country and the European member state. It is important to mention that the relevant information is, of course, the volume of electricity declared in units of energy, megawatt hours, and the third country that this electricity is coming from, directly at the border. And of course, the emission factors, which, as I mentioned before, the default approach will be to use the emission factor that will be provided in the CBAM transitional registry.
So thank you very much to both Ignacio and Claudia for your presentations. Now I'd like to give the floor again to Romain to develop the third part of the webinar, which will introduce the concept of the reporting obligations for the different actors in CBAM and reporting declarants.
Thank you, Alina. So this first slide basically provides you with an overview of the roles that each actor has to play in the implementation of the CBAM. So you can see there's quite a few. I will introduce them. Let me start with the authority. So we have first the Commission. Its role is to review the CBAM reports that are communicated by the reporting declarants. Then it communicates to the national competent authorities a list of reports for which it has reasons to believe they are not fully compliant with the CBAM regulation. And then thirdly, the Commission, it monitors the implementation of the CBAM, looks at progress, the risk of circumvention, and there will be reports issued by the Commission by the end of the transitional period on progress achieved so far. Then we have the national competent authorities in each member states. So you can see they are supported by the Commission in assessing the CBAM reports, but they are the one actually checking the reports and deciding whether or not they should engage in a dialogue with a reporting declarant in order to seek additional information if they have suspicions that the CBAM report is not compliant. And ultimately, it is these national competent authorities which ensure compliance with all the CBAM rules and requirements. It is not the Commission. From 2025 onwards, and only for definitive periods, those national competent authorities, they will also provide the status of authorized CBAM declarants that will be needed only for the definitive period. Then at the borders, we have the customs authorities. Of course, electricity is a particular good, so they will check at the borders of AORID numbers of the reporting declarants like you would have for other CBAM goods. Instead, so the measured incoming net flows of electricity at the interconnectors with third countries, they must be declared as they are already done at the end of each month. Otherwise, the customs authorities, they inform reporting declarants of the various CBAM obligations, and they provide data as well on imports to the commissions that might allow us to monitor, for example, the risk of circumvention under the CBAM. Then we have reporting declarants. At the poll at the start, we could see there was quite a lot of importers following this poll, so that might be interesting for you. So you have to be prepared to deliver data relating to embedded emissions. That's mostly default values, as we've seen before. So you might need to ask the producers of the good, the operator of the installation, for additional data if you don't have that. And of course, it is the reporting declarants who have the responsibility to submit the CBAM reports. Beyond each actor's role, as you can see, you need quite a degree of communication and coordination between each actors. That is the case for us. For example, the Commission, we have to dialogue thoroughly with the national competent authorities. That will be important during the review of the other CBAM reports, but it's also the case for other actors. The next slide explains the difference between importers and reporting declarants. So the CBAM applies to good imported in the EU, okay, but who actually has to bear the responsibility for carrying out the reporting obligations with the reporting declarant? So it's very often the case that it is the importer of the CBAM goods who is the reporting declarant, so that is the person responsible for doing the reporting. As Claudia and Ignacio explained in the case of electricity, so the reporting declarant would be the entity to whom the transmission capacity was allocated, and which actually imports electricity into the EU from a third countries. But sometimes the importer is not the reporting declarants. We have several situations. So we have to ask first, is the importer based in the EU? And we have several scenarios based on that. So we present if the importer is based in the EU, if the importer is not based in the EU. So first, if the importer is based in the EU, so you have several possibilities. Either the importer chooses to be a reporting declarant for CBAM purposes, or the importer can appoint a customs representative. So if the importer decides to appoint a customs representative, then that representative can be a direct representative, in which case the importer is still liable for the CBAM reporting obligations, or it can be an indirect representative. And in that case, the indirect representative, if they agree, they are the ones who bear the responsibility for the CBAM obligation. If the importer is not based in the EU, it's much more straightforward. Then the importer must appoint an indirect custom representative as a reporting declarant for the CBAM purposes. There's no other choice. It's compulsory to do that. Finally, but I've already mentioned that before, there's no authorization procedure for national competent authority to grant you the reporting declarant status during the transitional period. So that means that you will be able to undertake the reporting as soon as you receive the credential from the national competent authorities and as soon as the reporting period opens. And that I will explain in the next slides. For the definitive periods, there will be a little extra. This procedure I mentioned, the authorization that you need to obtain, that reporting declarants need to obtain in order to be granted the status of authorized CBAM declarants. But it's not for now. This will start. This will only be introduced in 2025 and will apply only for the definitive period in 2026. So if I'm the importer of electricity, what should I do to comply with the CBAM obligation? So for the import of electricity, it's a bit different compared to other CBAM goods. In some respects, it can be simpler. For example, as we've seen, there's only one CN code that needs to be looked at. There's only direct emissions, and we have default values which apply in most of the cases. So as an importer, basically, you need to know 4 things. You need to know the quantity of electricity that you import. You need to know the last country from which the electricity is imported from, so the country of origin. You will determine the embedded direct emissions, as explained already by Claudia and Ignacio. And if a carbon price was due in the country of origin, then you should report it as well, including during the transitional period. So if you do not have all this information at hand, then again, regular cooperation, communication with those who have the information, maybe TSOs, would be important to prepare for the transitional and also definitive phase. So I'm now moving on to the 4th points, but it will be a 4th section. We will provide you with a snapshot of the CBAM transitional registry, some basic information on the timeline as well during the transitional period. So during the transitional period, reporting declarants will submit CBAM reports via the CBAM transitional registry. So what is this CBAM transitional registry? It's a standardized, secure electronic database that was developed and is managed by the Commission to ensure the efficient implementation of the reporting obligation. So this database is going to collect the information reported during the transitional period by reporting declarants. We are going to deploy the registry from the start of the transitional period, so that should be in a few days by now. It will be accessible on the 1st of October. And reporting declarants will be able to undertake the reporting obligation as soon as they receive, as I mentioned, the credential from the National Competent Authority. No rush. The first deadline for the report is on the 31st of January 2024. The registry, it will be used for communications between many stakeholders implementing the CBAM, especially the national competent authorities, the reporting declarants. Any dialogue between them will take place through that registry. The Commission will not be the one dialoguing with the declarants, but we will also, of course, have access to the registry. It's also important to stress, under no circumstances will the information stored in the registry be made accessible to non-users of the registry. So the data and the communication exchanges between the users will remain confidential and secure. For instance, the data on installations in non-EU countries or the data on the goods and exchanges between the importers, the national competent authorities, none of this will be disclosed, of course. the CBAM competent authority, we are not going to use this for enforcement. The information we collect, we will only use to feed on the data analysis and collections during the transitional period. That will also help us refine the mechanism if necessary during the definitive phase. And finally, the registry will also be the basis for the development and establishment of the CBAM registry. You note the changing in name during the definitive period. So we have, during the transitional period, the CBAM transitional registry. This will be turned into the CBAM registry from 2026 onwards. So now you can see here on the slide a snapshot of the CBAM transitional registry's main page. So this is what awaits you as soon as we release the registry. Once they are logged in, the reporting declarant, they will see this page. They will access all the services, all the functionalities they need to comply with the reporting requirements. And this is where they go to submit the CBAM reports, only through that registry. The reporting declarants, so they will be able to navigate through the headings you see on the slides. We have my quarterly reports, my installations, the operators, my importers, my profile information. And that will allow them to use all these pages to gather, to retrieve, to upload, to edit, to save, to correct all the necessary information for the CBAM reports. All the functionalities of this platform, they've been designed to help and facilitate the communication between all parties in a consistent and time-effective manners to ensure a high level of confidentiality. We have a lot of IT colleagues who've been working very hard to provide you this service. So just briefly, I will go through all the headings. So in my quarterly reports, obviously reporting declarants will access information about the CBAM reports, including the previous and the current reports. In the installations, you will find information about the installations producing the CBAM goods that have been registered in relation to the reporting declarant's account. In the operators, you have information about operators managing the installations in relation to the reporting declarant's accounts as well. My importers is all the information that the importers have registered in relation to the accounts. And my profile information, well, it's the accounts, the reporting declarant's account information. This is nearly the end. On this slide, you can see a timeline of all the reporting requirements during the transitional period. So you can notice that flexibilities were provided in the Implementing Act governing the transitional period. For example, you see the first two CBAM reports, the timeline is slightly different. They are due respectively for the 31st of January 2024 and 30 April 2024, but they can be modified until the 31st of July 2024. So it's a flexibility we provide just in case modifications are needed. We understand it's a learning period again for everyone, so we provide this additional time. For all the other quarterly reports, the reporting declarants, they would be given the possibility to correct the reports up to 2 months after the end of the reporting period. During the definitive period, the CBAM reports, they will become the CBAM declaration, and they will not be submitted every quarter. They will be submitted annually every calendar year. So that means that the first report reporting the definitive period, the year 2026, they will have to submit a report for the year in 2027. We are here to help. I think that's an important message we want to convey ahead of the start of the transitional periods. We have a one-stop shop on our website where we upload all the new documents, all the information. We invite you to consult that regularly as we do make updates. For example, we will have new webinars again to explain how exactly the transitional registry works. So we will append again registration and have a link through that website. We can assist you via continuous updated documentation. We have e-learnings courses that we've started to upload on this page. They apply to each CBAM sectors. We've also released fact sheets on the website, a Q&A document that we are also going to update in light of all the questions we received by doing this series of webinars, and so on. So this is the learning period, and we are indeed going to support you for the start of the period. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romain, and thank you to my colleagues. Now we'll have a 2-minute break and get on to answering the questions. Sorry, 5-minute break and get on to answering your questions. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for all your questions. We have taken notes, and I'll let first my colleague Romain answer the more general questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your patience. So there was one question. If I do not have any imports for a given quarter, do I fill in 0? Do I not submit a CBAM report? That's actually a good question. So the CBAM regulation is only triggered if there's an import of a CBAM good during the transitional period. So if you import a CBAM good during a quarter, then you need to submit a report. If you do not import electricity during 1 quarter, then you do not need to submit the CBAM report because the CBAM obligation is not triggered. You don't need to do anything. What happens if I import, say, electricity through several member states? Do I have to submit several reports or just one? Then the answer is one. One report per importer identified by AOV number. It doesn't matter if the importer imports through the 27 EU countries. There will still be one access to the registry. We also had questions about default values. So first, until the 1st of July 2024, in case you don't have any information, you may use the default values. That was presented by Claudia and Ignacio. Until the end of the year 2024, if emissions are computed through different approach, we are also quite flexible regarding the different approaches for reporting emissions. But after that, you would have to provide the values according to the IEA or as my colleagues have made in their presentation. So if you need to engage with your supplier in order to obtain information, it will be required at some point to obtain the information. Okay, for electricity, it's a bit different, but you may still be required to have some information from the suppliers. Be reminded that the CBAM regulation applies to reporting declarants. They are the ones which are ultimately responsible, but dialogue is encouraged and very often necessary with the operators. On the operators, if they do not want to share the information, so I understand it may not be an easy process, especially at the start, because they're not used to doing that. And especially for goods which have already been produced, this one will provide flexibilities. We've expanded the deadline for the reporting. Electricity is easier because it mostly relies on default values, but still, if you need to engage with your supplier, then we suggest that you do that rather soon. And we want to advertise the communications templates we've released on our website that provides a sort of sheet with all the information that you might need from the operator. So you're more than welcome then to send that information over to your operator. And you're also welcome to look at in details the Annex 4 of the implementing regulation that specifies all the information that is required. It's optional. It's an optional template, but it contains all the information that you may require from the operator. Default values, I think there were some questions. Indeed, we have not released them yet. They will be released soon on the TaxUD website. And for electricity, they are quite important, especially the one from the IEA. Of course, for the other CBAM goods in general, we encourage importers to actually report the actual embedded emissions because this data will be useful ahead of the definitive period as well for us to refine, if necessary, all our default values. National competent authorities, there was also questions about who is the national competent authority in the member states. So it's important to remind that the governments had the choice to appoint, say, a ministry or an agency as a competent national authority. So it could be a climate authority, for example, or a budget ministry or Ministry of the Economy. This falls entirely in the hands of governments. We are compiling a list of all the relevant national competent authorities, and we will release it on our website as soon as we can. There were questions about the carbon price. I should mention that this is indeed mostly for the definitive period that you will be able to get the discounts for the carbon price effectively paid in the country where the goods was produced. We have some work at the Commission on this because we are going to work on a secondary legislation to specify exactly the principles and which carbon price under which conditions they will be accepted. In the meantime, during the transitional period, we invite you to report every carbon price that was paid. Finally, for me, there was a question about which country are exempted from paying the the CBAM financial obligations. There was a question about Switzerland, indeed. So all the countries which are fully linked with the EU ETS, so that includes all the EFTA and EEA member states, such as Switzerland, they do not fall within the scope of the CBAM regulation. So there's no CBAM reporting to be done with respect to those countries. The UK has an ETS, however, not fully linked with the EU ETS. So that means that the electricity imported from the UK will need to be reported. So it falls under the scope of the CBAM obligation. However, for the definitive phase, the carbon price paid in the UK will be discounted from the final financial obligation. I think that's all from my side.
Great. Thank you very much, Romain. Now we will give the floor to our colleagues Claudia and Ignacio, who will talk about the reporting and the methodology in more detail.
Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Romain. Yes, I think that it is really important to remind that no verification is required for the transitional period. Therefore, you don't need to verify emissions during this for the electricity production during this period. Also, another reminder, and apologies if I'm repeating information already shared by Romain, is that the default values for the emission factors will be available in the CBAM registry from the 1st of October. So you could find this data, which is based on the EAA data and covers a 5 years average for the calculation of the emissions of the electricity you are importing to the EU. Another reminder is that CBAM is not a tax, but is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and it tries to mirror the EU ETS. And regarding the reporting of actual emissions and power purchase agreements, there have been some questions raised in the chat. Just to clarify that for the transitional period, the existence of the power purchase agreement needs to be demonstrated through documentation. So the Commission, in order to accept those actual embedded emissions, needs to actually check and see that this PPA does exist. Also, kind of reminder of the conditions that need to be fulfilled in order to report on actual emissions is that the installation that is producing electricity, the electricity that is going to be imported into the union transmission system, this needs to have a PPA in place, and also it has to be directly connected to the union transmission system. So this is something to keep in mind when you want to report on actual emissions. And I think this is from me from the time being. Ignacio, you want to cover other aspects?
Just to complement and cover some of the questions we received. There were some questions about non-EU countries such as Switzerland, Norway. These are not included in CBAM electricity. The scope of the PPAs, as Claudia mentioned, is to prove the existence of the PPA. Of course, further details will be studied during this transitional period with a view into the final period, to have them ready when the final period starts. Other questions about volumes that are transmitted through I lost the question here, but through emergency situation. These are very particular cases, of course, are relevant for the security of supply, and therefore they should be studied with care. Of course, this type of transmission will be looked upon during the transitional period to have a final answer in the definitive period. Regarding to the CO2 formula, emission formula, the change of this formula, of this value, according to the renewable energy, as this, of course, increases in the grid of a third country, it is not obviously explicitly in the formula, but is implicitly there, every time that more generation from renewable sources will meet more demand in the domestic market, therefore less fossil fuel technologies will be needed to meet the demand, all other factors equal. Another question we received, the MRLBC. Very good question. This is of course a work in parallel that's going through different channels as part of the trade agreement with the UK post-Brexit. If this will be or not be considered a form of market coupling or price coupling or volume coupling, it remains to be seen, and this of course will be studied in detail during this period to have a final answer into the final period. I think I covered most of the questions here.
I have one. Yes, I think that also one clarification that is important for the electricity imported as a CBAM good is that the CBAM does not take into account the finality and the objective and the use of this electricity. What matters is the amount of electricity that enters and it's added to the union transmission system. Therefore, the use that will be given to this electricity is not relevant for the CBAM report's obligations.
Also, a clarification that CBAM electricity applies only to import flows and not net flows. So that's also relevant to consider in the declaration.
Thank you very much to both Ignacio and Claudia. I'd like to give the floor now to my colleague Thomas Brinkman, who's going to make a couple of clarifications as well, if he wants, no?
Yeah, maybe the bit on the questions that are related to a bit electricity and other sectors there. I've seen there were questions on are transport emissions included when they happen. It's the installation or in emissions related to lighting of the installation. There we have to clearly distinguish between electricity as a CBAM goods and all other CBAM goods. The basic principle is for electricity as a CBAM good, we only look at direct emissions. So emissions directly related to the lighting of the installation, basically that falls then out. And then and the principle generally is to use default emission factors. And that's also why the transport in the installation as such is usually also not relevant. There was a question also on the phase out of free allowances. This is a question clearly for the definitive period, but just to confirm that for electricity generated in the EU, there is no free allocation. So that's an aspect that then also needs to be not to be taken into account for electricity as a CBAM good.
Great, thank you very much, Thomas. I'd like to also answer a quick question that I've just read on the chat on carbon pricing. It is important to note that the purpose during the transitional period is to collect information. So, you know, as much information as you can give us on a carbon price paid, even if it's to a percentage of those emissions, is helpful for us. And we need to still define how this carbon price will be taken into account during the definitive period. So please, you know, bear with us. This is yet to be defined. I don't know if my colleagues, if there's anything else, anyone else who'd like to intervene. Otherwise, great. I would like to thank you all for participating in today's webinar. It will be recorded and published on our website very soon. So keep an eye out for that. And you will receive a feedback survey for the webinar session where you're invited to share with us your comments and your thoughts. So looking forward to seeing that. Also, you will surely receive a supporting material booklet that includes the presentation, as well as key takeaways and additional guidance that was prepared for this event. So thank you all and have a great day.